The feed began with the wrong music. A jaunty tune from an Empire recruitment ad trilled beneath the image of kneeling humans, while a cheerful voice announced that tomorrow would be brighter. Somewhere a producer panicked and killed the jingle, but the damage was done. Half the world laughed in the small, strangled way people do at funerals when someone knocks over a vase. The other half went suddenly silent, as if silence could bargain for mercy. The execution ground was a square of white stone floating like a raindrop inside a cavernous hangar. Floodlights sharpened every shadow until even the dust looked guilty. 50 prisoners, wrists bound behind their backs, faced a camera with faces you would have recognized as your neighbors if you squinted. Mothers and mechanics. A teacher with chalk still under his nails. A young woman whose eyes refused to blink for the audience. The Empire commander stepped into frame with a smile learned from a mirror and declared the event an instructional lesson in compliance. Beside him a junior officer tried to stifle a yawn, then failed, then shrugged at the lens as if to say executions were the new staff meetings. On Earth, screens bloomed open like night flowers. In city apartments and farm kitchens and underground shelters where the cheap smokes tasted like old books, people stopped. A baker put down his peel. A dockworker turned off the alarm on her wrist and forgot to breathe. In the coastal city where I worked restoring relic radios for a museum that could not pay me on time, I found myself in a crowd at a cafe where the owner had dragged a dented projector out of storage. She said this is historical, in the tone of someone who will never forgive history again. The room smelled of coffee and fear. The Empire commander gave a speech about the value of order, and in his pauses the prisoners made small sounds that were not words but were more convincing. The young officer checked his reflection in the blade of his ceremonial saber, and winked when he caught the camera catching him. The commander raised his hand. The crowd in the cafe flinched. Our mayor stood at the back of the room and tried to look as if she would know what to do next. A child in a red coat asked if the prisoners were going to go home after this. Her father said yes, and the entire room pretended to believe him for 7 seconds. The commander offered the prisoners last words. A mechanic coughed and said that the compressor on Dock 5 had a crack and someone should check it. The teacher started to recite a poem and got as far as the second line before the junior officer sighed so loudly that you could hear it on every moon with a receiver. The young woman who would not blink smiled without showing teeth and said, "Tell my brother to stop piloting like a show-off and land before the landing is over." The room at the cafe laughed again, smaller this time, but the laugh had teeth. The commander raised his hand again, perhaps to savor the power of repetition. Somewhere a producer fixed the music, because a drumroll started low and grew like a storm. Then the lights flickered. Not off, not entirely, but enough that the commander stopped speaking and glanced upward the way people do when they suspect the ceiling is about to confess. The flicker lasted 2 heartbeats, and in those heartbeats a noise traveled down cables and antennas and into the bones of anyone who was listening hard. It sounded like a breath close to your ear in a dark room. It sounded like a word beginning with B. When the lights steadied, the commander laughed and said technical issues, which is a phrase that means there are ghosts in the machine and they are not our ghosts. The blades rose. I reached for the shoulder of the stranger beside me and only realized afterward that I had marked his coat with coffee. The mayor crossed her arms as if to hold every citizen inside them. The child in the red coat pressed her hands to her ears. The drumroll stopped. There was no music anymore. There was an absence where music had been. The commander let his hand fall, and the blades fell too. The white stone drank the rest. The junior officer did not yawn this time. He swallowed. His throat worked like a small animal trapped in a pipe. For a long breath nobody in the cafe moved. Then a woman near the door whispered a prayer that named each of the 50 by the names on the churn, and I regretted that I had watched closely enough to memorize them. Outside, the city kept moving because cities must, but the steps were out of rhythm. On the street, a bus braked too late, and everyone scolded the driver as if sound could keep them from thinking. On the feeds, the Empire congratulated itself for choosing clean methods, and a government spokesman on our side attempted dignity by reading a statement written for a very different day. It used words like regrettable and reassess. It did not use the word grief, and so we added it ourselves, over and over, like a caption we could not stop writing. Within the hour, the argument started. Surrender now to save the ones left, said the voices who counted as realists. Fight to the end, said the ones who could not imagine living under the joke we had just heard. My friend Rin from the port posted a video where she wore an apron and chopped vegetables while listing practical ways to gum up an Empire shuttle. She laughed when she nicked her finger and kept talking, and her laugh traveled further than the clip itself. The comedians got busy. A dozen sketches mocked the commander's hair, the saber, the drumroll. A pirate stream played the footage backward with a commentary track that was equal parts fury and philosophy. By sunset you could buy shirts with a cartoon of the junior officer yawning on them, with the caption that said "I survived another meeting." People bought them because it hurt less to laugh while the wound was still open. In the council hall, leaders and officials and experts who had never forgotten to blink argued until their throats went raw. Someone shouted that resistance would only produce more bodies for the Empire to stack into their paragraphs. Someone else shouted that bodies stacked into paragraphs have spelled revolutions before. On the wall behind them, the faces of the 50 looked down from a still frame, and no one in the room sat with their back to the screen. Every proposal sounded smaller than the room deserved. Every warning sounded like a recycled headline. When the council broke for water and stubbornness, a courier slipped through the side door and handed the chair a slip of paper. The chair read it, paled, and folded the paper into a pocket with the carefulness of a person handling a live thing. In bars and kitchens, a rumor uncoiled. It had a simple shape. The rumor said the Boogeyman heard the drumroll and laughed. It said the Boogeyman had been a story told to recruits during training to make them run faster. It said the Boogeyman was what you called the shadow that fell across a patrol before the first alarm ever sounded. It said if you spoke the name in full daylight something in the rafters would shift, and a tool would go missing and end up somewhere more useful. It said different things depending on who you were asking, but it always lowered its voice at the end, as if sound itself could offend the thing it described. Rin called me and said, "Do you remember that old story about the operative who did not cast a reflection?" I said I remembered because everyone remembered, because recruiters had told it to us when they needed volunteers and we had rolled our eyes and pretended not to want to be part of a myth. The story said the Boogeyman arrived when we were most outnumbered, worked alone, left messages that could be read as jokes or threats depending on the angle of the light. The story always ended with the same line delivered in different voices. You are not fighting a person. You are fighting a consequence. The pirate stream that had reversed the execution added a new clip after midnight. It was only 4 seconds long and looked like corruption in the signal. A shadow crossed the white stone. A breath close to the microphone spoke a single syllable that might have been boo or might have been a consonant, and a grin. The clip could be a prank. It could be a joke planted by someone who needed people to sleep without dreaming of drumrolls. It could be the sort of coincidence that happens when a billion receivers hum at once. But in the cafe, where the projector still warmed the wall and the owner had forgotten to count the till, the clip made everyone lean forward. Someone near the back whispered there. Not an explanation. Not even a belief. Just a small word that made the air in the room lighter by half an ounce. Morning came as bravely as it could. The council reconvened and tried to glue courage to policy. The Empire posted a victory montage with music that sounded like a parade that had taken a wrong turn. Citizens went to work because electricity still needed shepherds and trains still believed in arriving. I walked to the museum, unlocked the door, and found a note tucked under the latch where no wind could have trapped it. 4 letters, handwritten in a slant that was not quite careful. Boo! I laughed now thinking of how gently I set the paper down, as if I might wake it. I told myself that Rin had left it to jolt me out of gloom, that the council had sent it to seed a myth. I told myself many reasonable things. Then I looked up and saw the shadow of a person on the frosted glass of the entrance, and by the time I reached the door there was no one there. The street breathed. The city blinked. Somewhere in the networks a breath leaned close again and let the rest of the word curl into our ears like a promise. The bar was already loud before the soldiers started shouting. It was one of those cramped frontier taverns where the light was always too yellow, and the tables leaned on uneven legs as if they were tired of being asked to support drunks. The crowd inside had been pretending to ignore the execution footage by drowning it in cheap liquor and worse music. Then a soldier with a crooked jaw and eyes red from more than alcohol slammed his cup on the table and announced that he would kill the entire Galactic Empire with his bare hands. People laughed at first, because bravado is a kind of currency in bars, but his voice cracked halfway through his promise, and that sound silenced everyone. A pair of aliens at the corner table, traitors with scales that glittered green under the light, leaned in and muttered about human lunacy. When the soldier staggered toward them, fists swinging like badly steered ships, the crowd prepared to let the inevitable happen. That was when the stranger moved. He had been sitting alone with the drink he had not touched, listening with a stillness that seemed more like focus than patience. As the soldier raised his fist, the stranger rose and caught the arm mid-swing, not with brute strength but with such clean precision that the motion seemed rehearsed. The soldier blinked, confused, and tried to pull back, only to find himself suddenly spun around and seated again, as though the stranger were tucking in a child. The entire bar paused to see if the soldier would retaliate. Instead, the soldier muttered a curse and looked down at his cup, as though the fight had never begun. The stranger's eyes met the room for one heartbeat. His expression was not a threat, not a smile, but something in between. Then he released the soldier and vanished toward the exit. No one saw him cross the floor, only that the door creaked and shut and the room remembered to breathe again. Rumors spread faster than spilled ale. By morning, people were whispering about the man who stopped a fight with no effort, who spoke no word yet made silence follow him like a pet. Some claimed he was taller than any man could be. Others swore he had no shadow. A merchant insisted she had seen him leave with 3 helmets under his arm, though no one had noticed any helmets in the bar that night. The whispers found their way to the barracks where tired recruits sat with empty cups and full hearts. They repeated the story the way children repeat ghost tales, daring each other to believe. In the end, the tale wore a single name like an old coat: the Boogeyman. In the chambers of command, the arguments deepened. Officers who believed in facts rolled their eyes at the rumor, while others leaned forward, voices sharp, insisting that the myth was worth more than regiments of soldiers. They remembered the old files sealed decades ago, the shadow program whispered about during late-night drills. It had not been meant for mass deployment but for psychological warfare. A phantom soldier who would never die because the mask would always pass to another. The project had been shut down for being too unstable, too dangerous, too much like letting a wolf guard the sheep. Yet here it was, resurfacing without their permission. The council chair asked if anyone truly believed a single operative could change the balance of war. No one answered with words. Instead, they thought of the 50 names from the execution list and said nothing. The Empire was not idle. Flush with their recent spectacle, they turned their attention to a mining outpost on the rim, a colony too small to fight back but rich enough to matter. Their ships fell on it like hawks. They burned what could not be stolen, marched survivors into pens, and broadcast another declaration of order. But when rescue teams arrived days later, they found something unexpected. The pens were empty, the guards dead, and in the ashes of the central hall someone had written with a soldier's blood 3 letters that made even hardened veterans stare. Boo! Survivors claimed they had seen a figure walk calmly through the fire, dragging the helmets of alien soldiers as if they were toys. They said the figure had laughed at the flames and then disappeared into smoke. Not one of the survivors agreed on the height, the voice, or the face. But all agreed on the name. Back at the colonies, hope returned in ragged pieces. Soldiers who had been drowning in grief sat up straighter at the rumor that the Boogeyman had chosen sides. Recruits who had nearly deserted sharpened their knives instead. Even comedians got involved, slipping jokes about the Boogeyman into their skits, portraying him as a polite monster who apologized before terrifying his prey. The laughter was a shield, but behind it the whisper grew teeth. The Boogeyman was not just alive. He was angry. And he was hunting. One night I walked home past the silent docks and found graffiti sprayed across the hull of an abandoned shuttle. a crude drawing of an alien officer running with his trousers around his ankles. Beside it, the word "boo" painted in letters so large they seemed to vibrate. A pair of dockworkers were laughing at it, but their laughter had an edge, as if they were half afraid the letters would peel off the metal and chase them home. The Empire tried to scrub such marks whenever they appeared, but the more they erased, the faster they multiplied. Boo became a banner, a prayer, and a dare. The Empire commanders grew restless. Reports trickled in of patrols ambushed without alarms, of soldiers waking tied together in humiliating knots, of supply depots left untouched except for mocking notes. One note found pinned to the chest of a dead guard read, "You snore too loudly." Another said, "Nice uniforms, shame about the training." The commanders raged in front of their subordinates, demanding answers. Who was this human ghost that slipped through their ships like smoke and left nothing but mockery behind? The junior officers began to dread their duties, not because of death but because of the laughter that would follow when they returned alive but humiliated. Meanwhile, the humans argued less. The myth had taken root so firmly that even skeptics stopped dismissing it out loud. They spoke instead about strategy. If the Boogeyman was real, how to use him? If he was not, how to pretend he was real long enough to keep hope alive? The answer was simple. You do both. Let the myth feed the man and the man feed the myth until the two cannot be told apart. The Boogeyman became less a person than a consequence. An idea sharpened into a weapon. And ideas are harder to kill than people. I remember standing again in that cafe when the first verified footage arrived. It showed a squad of Empire soldiers bound together in their own chains, stumbling naked into the desert, while a shadow lingered in the background. The shadow lifted a hand, waved once, and disappeared. The room erupted. Some laughed until they wept. Some wept until they laughed. The owner of the cafe poured a round of drinks on the house and declared that history was about to regret itself again. On the street outside, strangers hugged each other like family. The child in the red coat whispered that she knew he was real all along. And in the quiet that followed the noise, I thought I heard it again, that breath close to the ear, that sound of a promise too big to break. Boo! The Empire thought they were clever. They announced the capture of another group of human prisoners and declared that they would be held at a remote camp for public exchange. The announcement was made with the smugness of a teacher who believes he has outsmarted a classroom of restless children. To them it was a perfect trap. They believed the Boogeyman, if he existed, would come racing to free the prisoners. They had filled the camp not with captives but with waiting soldiers, heavy guns, and enough surveillance to shame a god. They even practiced their speeches in advance, lines about exposing human superstition, about humiliating the so-called ghost. They invited journalists from neutral systems to watch, convinced that they would finally corner and kill a legend. What they did not understand was that legends are not cornered. They slip through walls no one sees. The Boogeyman came not as a storm of violence but as a mistake that grew into a disaster. A guard at the outer wall heard a knock on the gate in the middle of the night. When he opened the viewing slit he found nothing but a tin cup dangling on a string, swinging gently in the wind. While he leaned out to untangle it, his comms filled with static. By the time he turned back, the cup was gone, and in its place was a note that said, "Do you know how silly you look right now?" He called for backup, only to hear laughter on the line that sounded suspiciously like his own voice played back at double speed. Within minutes, confusion spread across the base. Doors sealed shut by themselves. Barracks lights blinked in Morse code spelling out the word boo. Ammunition lockers jammed. Generators shut down, restarted, and blasted music instead of power. The soldiers had prepared for battle, but not for ridicule. At dawn, when the visiting journalists tuned in, they expected to witness an ambush. Instead they saw rows of Empire soldiers stumbling about covered in paint, their uniforms swapped with each other so that ranks were indistinguishable. A squad of officers was discovered bound to their own flagpoles with signs that read, "Take me seriously." Every corner of the camp carried graffiti in every known human language, each spelling the same word. Boo! In the center yard, where the prisoners should have been paraded, lay only helmets stacked into a crude pyramid. At the top sat another note, scrawled in messy handwriting. Thanks for the party. Try harder next time. The broadcast cut off suddenly, but not before the sound of laughter echoed through every frequency. That footage spread faster than fire through dry grass. Entire colonies howled with laughter. What had been despair turned to mockery. The Empire had planned to prove humanity weak. Instead, they proved themselves the butt of a joke too big to bury. On the Empire's central station, rage boiled hotter than their suns. The humiliation was unbearable. Losing soldiers was one thing. Losing face was far worse. The Council of Generals called for vengeance. The commander who had overseen the trap was stripped of rank and forced to kneel before his peers. He swore with trembling hands that he had seen no figure, no enemy, only shadows that mocked him. His words were met with jeers. Shadows do not topple empires, said one general. Yet every officer in the room felt the weight of that shadow creeping across their thoughts. They decided to summon the one man they believed incapable of fear. A warlord known across dozens of systems for his brutality, a general who had slaughtered entire populations to make examples of them. His name carried silence into rooms. His arrival was supposed to restore dignity. When the general's flagship arrived above the colonies, its shadow covered entire cities. The people on the ground looked up and trembled. His reputation was that of a butcher who neither bargained nor spared. He opened a broadcast directly to the human colonies, declaring that their ghost was nothing but smoke, and that he would peel away the mask to reveal the coward beneath. His voice rolled like thunder, but the reply that came was unexpected. A soft chuckle, followed by words delivered in a calm, amused tone. Nice uniform, the voice said. Did you steal the curtain from your mother's bedroom to make it? Laughter erupted across the human networks before the general could respond. The broadcast cut abruptly. The humiliation was complete. A man who thrived on fear had been mocked instead, and his wrath became desperate. But wrath does not kill what it cannot find. The Boogeyman began a game of war that was part sabotage, part theater. Empire patrols disappeared into forests, and returned days later with stories of whispers in the dark and footsteps behind them, though no one was ever seen. Ships launched with full cargo and landed empty, with mocking notes pinned to the cockpit glass. Even the Empire's propaganda feeds were hijacked. One evening they displayed not military pride but a puppet show performed with stolen helmets and sticks. The puppets enacted the execution of humans, but the end twisted into the humiliation of their own commanders, complete with sound effects of farting. Billions of viewers saw it before the feed was cut. The Empire scrambled to deny it, but the damage was irreparable. Fear had turned inside out into ridicule. And ridicule is a poison empires cannot stomach. For the humans, the Boogeyman's campaign became fuel. Colonists painted his name on walls, sang songs that mocked the Empire, and carried the legend like a torch. Every whispered report of another raid spread like wildfire. People told the stories around kitchen tables, laughing even as they sharpened their knives for battle. The myth was more than a soldier now. It was a banner, a mask anyone might wear, a whisper anyone might pass along. And the more the Empire tried to snuff it out, the larger it grew, like a flame fed by wind. There were still moments of doubt. Some argued that the Boogeyman could not be trusted, that he was too unpredictable, too dangerous to depend on. Others whispered that perhaps he was not human at all but some experiment gone wrong, a machine or a ghost born from grief. Yet when colonies debated surrender, all it took was a rumor that the Boogeyman had been sighted nearby to make the people stand their ground again. Fear of the Empire had been replaced by a new fear that worked in humanity's favor. The fear that surrendering meant betraying the legend who fought for them. The general's anger boiled into obsession. He launched a series of campaigns meant to flush the Boogeyman out, torching settlements, interrogating civilians, leaving no act of cruelty unspent. But each time his troops struck, the retaliation came not as open battle but as humiliation. His supply ships exploded into fireworks over his own camps. His lieutenants woke chained together in compromising positions with signs taped to their foreheads. Once, during a live address, his screen was hijacked mid-sentence to display a single word scrawled across the stars. Boo! His subordinates laughed behind their hands. His soldiers whispered the name at night. His fury grew so great that even his own men began to fear him less than the shadow they could not catch. What began as a rumor in a bar had now evolved into something larger than life. The Boogeyman was no longer a figure but a force, a consequence of the Empire's arrogance. Where once humans had mourned their dead in silence, they now laughed at their enemies and drew strength from the legend. And as for the Empire, their mightiest general, who had believed himself immune to fear, now found his every step followed by whispers and shadows. He had come to unmask the Boogeyman. Instead, he found himself dancing to the strings of a ghost who played war like a game, a ghost who could turn terror into comedy and comedy into rebellion. The game was only beginning, and the board was larger than either side had yet imagined. The colonies began to sound different. In place of the heavy hush that had followed the executions came a new rhythm, a clatter of workers returning early to their shifts and staying late, a bustle of markets that had been half empty, and now overflowed with cheap banners painted with a single word: Boo! Street performers rewired old radios to blast jokes about the Empire during lunch breaks. Dockyard unions held meetings that started with security plans and ended with impromptu sing-alongs where verses were improvised to mock imperial accents. The mayor, who once spoke only in careful announcements, now walked the streets with her sleeves rolled up, helping bolt sheet metal over windows and laughing when the bolts stripped. At night the cafe stayed open until dawn, and the projector played not propaganda but home videos of people practicing drills in alleyways. Children turned the word boo into a game that made strangers smile when they heard it from across the square. All of this did not erase grief, but it gave grief a place to stand. Rin visited the museum and dropped a bag of tools on the counter, as if she had decided that I had rested enough. She said the docks were organizing a convoy to run supplies past an imperial cordon, and they needed the old radios to talk without being overheard. I reminded her that old radios were hearable by anyone with ears. She said that was the point, and then looked toward the door as if expecting someone to enter. When no one did, she leaned closer and asked if I had noticed it too, the way the rumors had shifted. Less a single shadow and more dozens of small ones moving in step. I told her about the messages arriving in different places at the same hour, about the reports of the same voice taunting a patrol on one moon, while another patrol swore the same voice had whispered to them in a different sector. She grinned like a thief. That is not a ghost, she said. That is a chorus. The Empire tried to drown the chorus. A blanket order shut down entertainment feeds across half their territory after midnight, alleging maintenance on the networks. The next midnight, every blacked-out screen flickered back to life with a single frame of a paper note and a handwritten word. Boo! Imperial police raided printing presses and arrested comedians, and still the jokes multiplied, because jokes are weeds that grow in sidewalk cracks. When a border garrison posted fresh wanted posters for a human operative described as tall and short with blue eyes and brown hair and a limp and a perfect stride, someone pasted tiny speech bubbles on them that said "Make up your mind." By the end of the week the posters had been collected because soldiers could not pass them without trying not to laugh. It was around this time the whisper came that the Boogeyman would try something impossible. Not a raid, not a prank, but a step into the core of Imperial pride, the flagship that anchored the general and his fleets. The rumor ran ahead of itself and changed shape as it traveled, which is the way of rumors, but the course stayed the same. Someone was going to walk into the lion and tickle its throat. I did not sleep the night before the rumor was supposed to mature into action. I sat at the museum bench with the receiver open like a patient under delicate surgery, and thought about the moment when a story has to stop being a story long enough to be a plan. It began with a small sound, the click of a maintenance hatch unlatching on a ship so large it cast seasons on planets beneath it. Security cameras watched the corridor, but saw only what they were meant to see. A figure in a gray coverall, the exact shade and scuff as 1,000 others, carried a coil of cable and whistled a tune that had been banned that morning. A security sergeant nodded without looking up from his console. The figure set down the cable and opened a junction box and slipped a slender device inside that did not belong to any manual. Lights did not flicker. Doors did not shudder. No alarms whispered. The figure moved on. When a cadet rounded the corner and nearly collided with him, He steadied the cadet with a gentle hand and said he had just saved the cadet from the humiliation of wearing his cap backward in front of the general. The cadet flushed, corrected his cap, thanked him, and in his embarrassment never noticed that the stranger wore no insignia at all. Deck by deck the figure threaded the ship with quiet disobediences. A sensor set to blink at the wrong intervals, a service lift told to take the scenic route, a coffee machine persuaded to spill at the exact moment a junior officer needed to sign a manifest. This was not sabotage in the theatrical sense. It was the sort of careful mischief that builds a tower of tiny errors and waits for gravity. At one point, a patrol halted him and asked for his identification. He raised his hands slowly and said that he had lost it 2 corridors back when he tripped over a new policy. The patrol stared for 3 heartbeats, then laughed despite themselves, and waved him through while promising to keep a sharper eye on policies in the future. The heart of the ship was a chamber that smelled of metal and confidence. Here the general liked to address his crews, standing before a banner that draped the wall. It was not a curtain from anyone's mother, though the fabric did look theatrical under harsh lights. The figure paused at the threshold as if listening to a familiar song. Then he crossed the floor and climbed the maintenance ladder embedded in the wall behind the banner, a space too narrow for anyone who did not know to breathe out while squeezing through. At the top, hidden within the scaffolding that supported the pride of the fleet, he affixed a small device the size of a book. He paused and rested his forehead against the cool struts. No prayer, only stillness. When he climbed down the ladder again, he encountered a cadet no more than 19 who froze like a deer. The figure said that if anyone asked, the cadet should say he had been practicing heroic stillness. The cadet nodded solemnly, as if he had been given a new order. The figure smiled and vanished around a corner that led not to an exit but to a closet marked "Do Not Enter." While all this occurred, on the ground below, councils met and gambled. They had a choice between trying to coordinate with a myth and trying to stay out of the way. They chose both. Official orders went out for a series of minor protests and logistical disruptions that drew imperial attention in a dozen directions. Unofficial networks carried different instructions for different cells, none of whom knew the full picture. People who had never met one another moved in patterns that only made sense when viewed from far above. The effect was a symphony you could hear but not score. When a factory shut down because workers all caught the same sudden cough, when a freight yard misplaced an entire convoy, when street performers led impromptu parades that blocked traffic at just the wrong moment, it was hard to say whether this was all a happy accident or a web. The device in the flagship woke at the exact moment the general strode onto the dais to berate his crews for becoming a punchline. The first thing it changed was not the weapon's grid or the gravity but the sound. A breath close to the microphone, then a single syllable stretched like a cat taking its time. Boo! The banner behind him unfurled of its own accord and revealed a painted caricature that someone with a steady hand had sketched in the night. The general stood there with crossed eyes and a sign around his neck that read, "I took myself very seriously." The chamber erupted. Some officers tried to pretend they had not seen it. Others laughed in shock and then choked their laughter back like a confession. The general reached for his sidearm and found a novelty flower in its holster. Water sprayed his face. He roared. Systems hiccuped. Doors locked, unlocked, locked again. Elevators halted between decks long enough for small groups of soldiers to learn that they did not enjoy the company of their own reflections. By the time the device finished its work and burned itself to ash, the flagship had not fired a shot, but it had fired something far more dangerous. Doubt. We learned later that a team had run the infiltration, not a single ghost. A woman who had grown up stealing fruit from market stalls while guards looked right through her. A man who had been dismissed from basic training for refusing to salute on the grounds that salutes were a poor substitute for competence. A pair of twins who never spoke in public but on missions could finish each other's sentences without sound. They wore the same mask when it mattered, and their voices on the comms blurred into one. Afterward, when I met one of them in a safe house to deliver a radio that hummed in all the right places, I asked if he was the Boogeyman. He laughed and shook his head. No, he said. We are. Then he tapped the radio as if it were a sleeping animal and added that even we is not enough. It was the council chair who finally put it plainly in a room where the lights were too bright to allow superstition. The Boogeyman is a program, she said. Not a project on paper, not one operative to be hunted down, but a rotation of specialists taught to wear the same shadow. When one falls, another steps forward without a seam showing. The name is not a person. It is a mask. It is a promise. Around the table, leaders who had been guarding the myth as if a loud truth might break it exchanged glances that said relief and fear. Relief because a legend had logistics. Fear because logistics could fail if mismanaged. The chair continued. The point is not that any one of them is unstoppable. The point is that the Empire cannot kill an idea in a corridor. News of the infiltration spread with the usual embellishments, because people cannot resist flavoring a dish that is already good. Some said the general had wept. He had not. Some said the device had made the ship sing lullabies. It had not. But the essential truth stood. The flagship had been mocked from within while its master watched helplessly. The colonies took that truth and fed on it. Recruitment surged without any posters. Volunteers lined up at dawn outside garages that had been quietly converted into training spaces. Old men and women whose knees were not what they had been asked for jobs that required sitting and listening. Teenagers practiced moving in a group with their heads up. The laughter in the streets softened into something steadier, a hum of people who understood that a joke can be a bridge to a more serious place. That night, when the cafe finally closed and the projector went dark, I walked past the harbor where ships slept with their lights out. The wind off the water smelled like rust and salt and a little like victory, which has no scent until you decide it does. In a shadow between two crates, someone stood watching the sky. I approached and asked if he thought it would hold. He said nothing for a moment, as if testing the shape of my question, then replied that it did not need to hold in the way buildings hold. It needed to travel. Tomorrow, he said, another team will wear the mask. You will not know their names. That is good. You will not know their faces. That is the point. You will hear one word and you will laugh, and your laughter will be a rope someone else can climb. Then he stepped sideways and was gone, the shadow reknitting itself without a seam. Above us the flagship hung like a bad idea, a little less sure of itself, and below it the city slept with the smile it had earned. The war had reached its breaking point. Entire sectors burned, fleets vanished into ambushes, and whispers of rebellion spread faster than imperial patrols could silence them. The Empire, once untouchable, was staggering beneath the weight of chaos. Humanity, once enslaved and mocked, had clawed its way into the heart of the galaxy's struggle. But with every victory came escalation, and now the rebellion faced the greatest challenge yet. The Empire was collapsing, but a collapsing beast is the most dangerous of all. Across battlefields stretched from the moons of Saturn to the glittering cities of Arion Prime, the Empire unleashed its might. Legions of soldiers were marched out not to win but to annihilate. The order from the Emperor was clear: no negotiations, no mercy, crush humanity so thoroughly that no child would dare dream of rebellion again. But the rebels had become something else, something far more dangerous than armies. They were the ruthless storm, a tide of fury and unpredictability, and the storm could not be contained. The final battles unfolded in chaos. On the industrial world of Saturn, rebels detonated entire factories, luring in regiments before collapsing smokestacks onto their heads. On the desert planet Orith, farmers armed with nothing more than flamethrowers and mining drills tore through armored convoys. In the orbit of Earth itself, ships crewed by smugglers and exiles rammed imperial cruisers in suicidal strikes, laughing into their calms as their final words. Every sector became a stage, every clash a performance, and the galaxy watched in horror and awe as humanity bled and laughed at the same time. Yet even in their ruthless storm, something unexpected emerged. Amid the carnage, some rebels began to choose mercy. In the city of Velar, a group of captured Imperial soldiers were lined up for execution before an audience of cheering rebels. But instead of pulling the trigger, the commander ordered their release, announcing that humanity would not mirror the cruelty of its enemy. The decision sparked argument and fury among other fighters, but it spread like wildfire. The galaxy watched the footage and was stunned. For so long the rebels had been seen as merciless beasts, yet here they were showing restraint the Empire never had. The contradiction confused and inspired in equal measure. It proved that even in their chaos, humanity could choose not to be the monsters the Empire claimed they were. This twist unnerved the Empire's leaders more than any ambush. They knew how to crush enemies who fought with savagery, but they did not know how to respond to an opponent who could be both ruthless and merciful, who could laugh while killing but also refuse vengeance when victory allowed it. Soldiers began to defect in larger numbers, some even turning their weapons on their commanders. Civilians rose in riots that spread faster than Imperial troops could suppress. The throne was cracking not just from force but from doubt, and doubt was the one weapon the Empire could never defend against. Inside the Imperial Palace, the Emperor raged. His voice thundered through the halls as he demanded loyalty, but even among his own court there were whispers of fear. He decided to reclaim control the only way he knew how, with another broadcast. He would mock humanity himself, humiliate them before billions, and prove that he was untouchable. The stage was prepared, the cameras ready, the galaxy forced once again to watch. The Emperor sat on his throne of gold and sneered into the lens, speaking of humanity as vermin, as animals too stupid to survive without his mercy. He laughed, a cruel echo of the synthetic laughter that had started it all. But fate had other plans. As he mocked them, the rebels struck. A hidden signal hijacked the broadcast, just as Zara had once done in the station. Only this time, the failure belonged not to the rebels but to the Empire. The systems glitched, the Emperor's grand speech warped into absurd squeals and distortions, his proud face distorted into grotesque caricatures. Across the galaxy, billions roared with laughter not at humans but at him. His furious shouts only made it worse. He stood, shouting for silence, and in his rage tripped over the edge of his throne's platform. The cameras caught every detail, the mighty ruler sprawling on the floor like a clown before the galaxy he meant to terrify. He rose to scream again, and in that moment a blast rocked the palace. Rebels had breached the outer defenses. The feed cut, but the damage was irreversible. The last image billions saw of their emperor was not of power but of a man made into a joke. The palace fell within days. The emperor tried to flee, but he was cornered not by generals or assassins, but by ordinary rebels, miners and farmers who had come to see the end. He died not in glorious battle but in irony, mocked until his last breath, begging for dignity that he had never granted his victims. When the rebels told the story later, they said the galaxy's greatest tyrant died laughing, though whether it was his own or theirs, no one could quite agree. With his fall, the empire unraveled. Governors surrendered, fleets deserted, and worlds declared independence. The rebellion, once scattered, now stood at the center of a galaxy trembling on the edge of something new. Victory had come, but it was a victory laced with scars. Millions were dead, cities reduced to ash, families broken beyond repair. The rebels who survived bore the weight of what they had done, the brutality they had embraced, the lives they had taken. They had unleashed humanity in its rawest form, and now they had to decide what came next. Zara stood once more before a recorder, her face older, harder, yet still burning with fire. She spoke to the galaxy not with mockery this time, but with something gentler. She said humanity had won not because it was stronger, not because it was more ruthless, but because it had refused to be silenced. She reminded them of the first broadcast, of the woman who spat in defiance before the rope took her life, of the laughter that had grown out of pain, of the stubborn refusal to kneel. She told the galaxy that the rebellion's greatest weapon had not been brutality, but the ability to laugh through horror, to mock tyrants until they crumbled. That, she said, was humanity's punchline. Across worlds, people cheered. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stared at the stars in silence. The empire was gone, but the future was uncertain. Yet for the first time in generations, humans could shape it themselves. The war had ended not with despair but with irony, a tyrant undone by the very theater of cruelty he once commanded. And so the story of the rebellion closed not with silence but with sound, with the echo of laughter carried across battlefields now quiet, across ruins now waiting to be rebuilt, across the stars that no longer belonged to an empire. Humanity had survived, had risen, had unleashed its storm, and in the end, it had discovered that its greatest weapon was not the sword or the bomb, but the refusal to surrender its spirit. The galaxy, once ruled by fear, now carried a different sound, one that promised both healing and danger. The sound of humanity laughing at the impossible, laughing even in the face of death, laughing as it stepped into the future it had claimed with its own blood and fire.